I'm Tim Kubarich, and I'm here with Patrick Todd and David Glickman, analysts at Harding Loevner. We all know when we walk into a Walgreens and you see side by side a bottle of Advil next to a bottle of generic ibuprofen, that the generic industry has made a big impact on drug pricing. But those are really small molecule or chemical drugs. If we think about more complex drugs, what are biosimilars, and how is the biosimilar industry different to the generic small molecule industry?
So before we talk about biosimilars, I think we should talk about biologics and what are biologics. So biologics are proteins that are grown in cells and then purified and made into drugs. In contrast, small molecule drugs are chemically synthesized. So the manufacturing process for the biologics is significantly more intensive. Biosimilars are generic copies of those biologic drugs. And the barriers to entry, given the difficulty of manufacturing those drugs, is significantly higher. There's also some regulatory barriers. Because they're grown in cells, they end up being a little bit different than the reference drug. So you have to do clinical trials to prove that the drug is efficacious.
Whereas for a generic small molecule drug, they do very small studies on healthy patients and just seeing the levels of that drug in the bloodstream of those healthy patients. And that's much faster and much cheaper.
So with this increased complexity on manufacturing, what kind of companies compete in the space? And what have been their capital expenditure plans to meet this demand?
So we have the companies that are doing the research and actually producing the biologics, companies like Celltrion and Samsung, which are Korean companies. We also have some of the innovators getting into biosimilars, so like companies like Pfizer, for example. And then you have a lot of companies that are supplying the products, so that's the bioreactors needed to grow the product, the supplies, the purification equipment. And those companies are like Sartorius, which is a German company, Merck KGaA, which is another German company, Thermo Fisher in the US, Danaher, and even GE Healthcare makes products for these companies. The Capex plans looking forward are pretty robust across the industry because there's a number of products coming off patent. If you look at the top selling drugs in the world today, they're more or less all biologics, and they're all coming off patent. So we know biosimilars are going to be on the market, and you have to have the manufacturing to make those products.
With the patent expiry of a lot of these more complex molecules, it seems like it will bode well for the manufacturers of biosimilars. But will the companies be able to profit from that development, or are they kind of competing away this profit pool?
So we're very early on in this, and in Europe we've seen prices for biosimilars on the market see sharp reductions from the original innovator price. However, in the US we're seeing less of that. In the US, typically what you'd see in small molecule drugs is the innovator would remain on the market at the branded price, and generics would price at a 95% plus discount, and the innovator would lose almost all of that revenue very quickly within a few quarters. For biosimilars, they've made a substantial investment. They don't want to price it at a 90+% discount. They may come in at a 25-30% discount. So pricing can come down more gradually, and then at some point it's actually worth it for the innovator to compete on price. We see that currently with J&J and Remicade in the US. AbbVie has said with Humira going biosimilar in about 5 years that they will compete on price. So those established branded manufacturers have the manufacturing capacity, and it makes sense at some point to compete on price, whereas in the small molecule space it doesn't make any sense. They just let it go.
So these high barriers to entry with that complexity in terms of manufacturing and more stable prices seems to bode well for the profitability of the industry. Are there any risk factors, though, that investors should be concerned about?
The biggest risk, in my opinion, is because they're so difficult to manufacture, you're going to get some adverse event at a plant, and the drug is going to get pulled from the market, and it might ripple through, and then people will have a distrust of biosimilars. So in the event that you have some issue with the FDA or maybe European Medicines Agency that causes the ramp to slow down, I think that would be that's the biggest risk, in my opinion.
And kind of a risk on the positive side, within the US right now, there are no guidelines on interchangeability. So right now, if your doctor writes a prescription for something where a biosimilar is available, you would only get that biosimilar if the physician specifies that biosimilar by name. Whereas for a small molecule drug like Lipitor, if the physician just writes Lipitor, you're most likely get the generic automatically. The executive branch in the U.S. is working on guidelines for interchangeability, and when that does happen, it should relieve one of the bottlenecks to that substitution and to biosimilar penetration.
And what are the key takeaways when thinking about investing in biosimilars?
From my standpoint, I think that the most attractive space are the supplier companies. And I use the analogy like, selling picks and shovels to gold miners. So that's companies like, Thermo Fisher, Danaher, Sartorius, Merck, KGaA. The suppliers are actually very concentrated, and these companies need to buy the bioreactors, the supplies, the filtration equipment. And so those companies will definitely benefit from this big uptick in biosimilar growth.
And I would mention with the industry overall, I think it's healthy for the system for biosimilar penetration to increase. When biologics were first approved around the turn of the century, it was thought that it could have a lifespan that was closer to indefinite. Now that we know that that's not the case, that once the patents lapse, that they can get real competition, then it frees up money in the system to pay for new innovative drugs. So it's a natural evolution of the system.